Hey, I'm watching a video by This Does Not Compute about the rise and fall of netbook computers, and he's made quite a few errors, I believe. Now, netbooks started out with the Asus EEE PC, the original 7-inch. It was a 1024 by 600 resolution display on a 7-inch panel. It was running a version of Ubuntu, not Ubuntu. It was a custom Linux installation that was designed to be easy to use and simple to get on the internet with. Basically, it's the precursor to the modern day Chromebook. It had a limited set of applications. It had limited RAM. It had very limited storage. It only had 4 gigabytes of storage internally, and basically, these things came out, they started to get popular. There was quite a few that was sold. And then Microsoft got onto it and like, hold on, we want to get onto this too. We can't have Linux taking this sort of impact on our user base. So what they ended up doing was releasing Microsoft Windows for netbooks, which was basically an extremely cut down version of Windows XP that could do one or two, limited amounts of things at a time. It was Windows Starter Edition, I think it was called, and it was very limited in what you could do with it, where the Linux one could do a lot more. But anyway, so basically what happened was I believe the original netbook was running a Celeron chip, not an Atom. But Intel jumped onto this. They're like, hey, we can release a new platform. So that what they did was they released the Atom chip for these units. The problem with the Atom chip, and this is where netbooks kind of failed, was the whole architecture, the whole scheme around it was so limited. And it was limited not because it had to be, but because this is what Intel enforced when they made the chips. So they limited the processor to being able to support at the most of 1 gig of RAM initially, I believe. And 1 gig of RAM in Windows doesn't work because I think at this point there was a crossover between the Windows XP version and then Windows 7 Starter Edition, which carried on until pretty much the end of when netbooks failed. Same problem with Starter Edition. You couldn't do a lot of things with it. It was restricted. You couldn't change your background. You could install programs, but you could only run a limited number at a time. It couldn't handle multiple concurrent applications, which is all good and well if all you're doing is the internet. But if you're doing internet for a bit of research and you've got programs open to copy and paste data through and all this sort of thing, you really start getting bogged down in the detail, and it does limit what you're able to do there, which is kind of a bad thing. But because the Intel Atom CPU was so limited in what it can do in terms of performance, a little bit as well, because as these chips progressed, the requirement for the video system to be capable or more capable for things like video decoding, real-time H.264 decoding, which is MPEG-4, pretty much what the internet's been standardized on now. All these things needed the processing power in the video chip to do the decoding. Otherwise, every time you tried to run one of these videos, the processor would be pegged at 100%, which meant it couldn't do shit. But when Microsoft released their cut price licensing for Windows 7 Starter Edition, the limitation as it was sold was it would only be provided on computers that were below a certain screen resolution, I believe, and also it had to have it had to be shipped with at most of 1 gig of RAM. Windows 7 doesn't work on 1 gig of RAM. It is hopeless. On the second iteration of the Atom chips, you could upgrade the RAM from 1 gig to 2 gig, and that was your lot. There was no getting over that. You couldn't expand beyond that. Even though the second generation Atom chips were 64-bit capable, there was never any drivers released for the video system. So you could run the processor in 64-bit, you could never use the driver for the video chip, which meant you're back on the standard VGA, no hardware acceleration, and all the things that go with that. But what happened was, and this is where I think things got shot, and I think the reason it got shot is because everyone was afraid of cannibalizing other markets. And in doing so, I think they really killed off a segment that would have done a lot better if it wasn't so neutered. Pretty much they turned what could have been, or it kind of spawned from the UMPCs, or the ultra mobile PCs, which were like the little, Sony did a couple, the little flip up Sony Vaio laptop palm handheld PC thing. A few others did it. If you go back to the 486 and Pentium days, Toshiba had one. It was the Libretto, a little tiny computer. But back then, they weren't neutered outside of... no, they weren't really neutered much at all, really. I mean, they were quite capable. But they could run the full OS. Anyway, it's... yeah. But that sort of thing is where the netbooks kind of spawned from. So you had the UMPC craze, which ran through, and then Asus took the concept of it and turned it into this little all-in-one 7-inch laptop. I had one. I had it when it was first released. It was actually kind of a cool machine. Its limitations were a pain in the ass. Actually, it wasn't 1024 by 600. It was 800 by 480. That's right, because you had to use a special setting on it. You could make it so you could scroll up and down through the screen, but otherwise it was 800 by 480. It kind of worked for them. But anyway, so they basically released... I mean, Asus did it as kind of a, look what we can do. You know, this could be pretty cool for people who just want to get on the internet and do things. But then everyone else jumped on board, and they're like, well, Intel jumped on making better chips for it within limitations. Microsoft jumped on with their Windows OS with special licensing for these stripped-down machines on the proviso that they were artificially neutered out of the box. And then pretty much that's where they kind of died. The hardware, if it had progressed a bit better, it would have gotten a lot better. It would have been, you know, I think the segment would have still existed today. I mean, the market for a small 10-inch does everything a bigger computer does, just a bit slower, would still be a good idea now, if it wasn't for the fact that everyone who experienced one of these netbooks when they came out were pretty much put off by the fact that they're horrible machines, purely because they don't have the memory capability, and the CPU is kind of limited. But I think most of it came down to memory. If these machines had 2 gig out of the box, expandable to 4 gig, even though on 32-bit you can only use about 3 gig of RAM. If they allowed it to come out, if Microsoft allowed it to come out with 2 gig straight out of the box, these things would have still been useful. Because on 2 gig, even on, you know, on well, they had 320 gig hard drives and things, and some of these at the end of it. Even with, say, a 4 gig flash stick, SD card in the side of the machine, enabled for Ready Boost, then the machines became quite capable. The battery life wasn't terribly bad either. I mean, you were getting, on a good machine, you were getting 3 to 4 hours out of a 3-cell battery. And that's older technology, lithium batteries too, but you know, they weren't too bad. But the downside to them was the fact that they were just released neutered, and that's where it all kind of failed, I guess. The Atom chip is officially dead these days, but it did carry on in a lot of mobile phones. They managed to get the Atom chips to an efficiency level where mobile phones could run on them. They had them running in a lot of tablets. Acer were pretty big on having Atom-based tablets. That's the outside of all this is your 7-inch or 8-inch Windows tablets, which are pretty much non-existent now too. And all of this is because the Atom chip's been discontinued, I believe. But yeah, they were so close to making these things work and viable, but then they just kept shooting themselves in the foot. So the reason they failed, they were just neutered too much. Anyway, thanks for watching. Stop.